Chapter 7. The Monks. Father Michael, a pleasant, fresh-faced, smiling man, perhaps of 35, took me to the pantry and gave me a glass of liqueur to stay me until dinner. We had some talk, or rather, I should say, he listened to my prattle indulgently enough, but with an abstracted air, like a spirit with a thing of clay. And truly, when I remember that I descanted principally on my appetite, and that it must have been by that time more than 18 hours since Father Michael had so much as broken bread, I can well understand that he would find an earthly savour in my conversation. But his manner, though superior, was exquisitely gracious, and I find I have a lurking curiosity as to Father Michael's past. The whet administered, I was left alone for a little in the monastery garden. This is no more than the main court, laid out in sandy paths and beds of party-coloured dahlias, and with a fountain and a black statue of the Virgin in the centre. The buildings stand around it, foursquare, bleak, as yet unseasoned by the years and weather, and with no other features than a belfry and a pair of slated gables. Brothers in white, brothers in brown, passed silently along the sanded alleys, and when I first came out, 3 hooded monks were kneeling on the terrace at their prayers. A naked hill commands the monastery upon one side, and the wood commands it on the other. It lies exposed to the wind. The snow falls off and on from October to May, and sometimes lies 6 weeks on end. But if they stood in Eden, with a climate like heaven's, the buildings themselves would offer the same wintry and cheerless aspect. And for my part on this wild September day, before I was called to dinner, I felt chilly, in and out. When I had eaten well and heartily, Brother Ambrose, a hearty, conversible Frenchman, for all those who wait on strangers have the liberty to speak, led me to a little room in that part of the building which is set apart for those on retreat. It was clean and whitewashed and furnished with strict necessaries: a crucifix, a bust of the late Pope, the Imitation of Thomas à Kempis in French, a book of religious meditations, and the life of Elizabeth Seton, evangelist, it would appear, of North America and of New England in particular. As far as my experience goes, there is a fair field for some more evangelization in these quarters, but think of Cotton Mather. I should like to give him a reading of this little work in heaven, where I hope he dwells, but perhaps he knows all that already, and much more, and perhaps he and Mrs. Seton are the dearest friends and gladly unite their voices in the everlasting psalm. Over the table, to conclude the inventory of the room, hung a set of regulations for those on retreat: what services they should attend, when they were to tell their beads or meditate, and when they were to rise and go to rest. And at the foot was a notable NB. Free time is employed in the examination of conscience, in confession, and in making good resolutions. To make good resolutions, indeed. You might talk as fruitfully of making the hair grow on your head. I had scarce explored my niche when Brother Ambrose returned. An English boarder, it appeared, would like to speak with me. I professed my willingness, and the friar ushered in a fresh, young little Irishman of 50, a deacon of the church, arrayed in strict canonicals, and wearing on his head what, in default of knowledge, I can only call the ecclesiastical shako. He had lived 7 years in retreat at a convent of nuns in Belgium, and now 5 at Our Lady of the Snows. He never saw an English newspaper. He spoke French imperfectly, and had he spoken it like a native, there was not much chance of conversation where he dwelt. With this, he was a man eminently sociable, greedy of news, and simple-minded like a child. If I was pleased to have a guide about the monastery, he was no less delighted to see an English face and hear an English tongue. He showed me his own room, where he passed his time among breviaries, Hebrew Bibles and the Waverley novels. And thence he led me to the cloisters, into the chapter house, through the vestry, where the brothers' gowns and broad straw hats were hanging up, each with his religious name upon a board. Names full of legendary suavity and interest, such as Basil, Hilarion, Raphael, or Pacifique. Into the library, where all the works of Voyot and Chateaubriand, and the Ode et Ballade, if you please, and even Molière, to say nothing of innumerable fathers and a great variety of local and general historians. Thence my good Irishman took me round the workshops, where brothers bake bread and make cartwheels and take photographs, where one superintends a collection of curiosities, and another a gallery of rabbits. For in a Trappist monastery, each monk has an occupation of his own choice, apart from his religious duties and the general labours of the house. Each must sing in the choir if he has a voice and ear, and join in the haymaking if he has a hand to stir. But in his private hours, although he must be occupied, he may be occupied on what he likes. Thus I was told that one brother was engaged with literature, while Father Apollinaris busies himself in making roads, and the abbot employs himself in binding books. It is not so long since this abbot was consecrated. By the way, on that occasion, by a special grace, his mother was permitted to enter the chapel and witness the ceremony of consecration. A proud day for her to have a son, a mitred abbot. It makes you glad to think they let her in. In all these journeyings to and fro, many silent fathers and brethren fell in our way. Usually, they paid no more regard to our passage than if we had been a cloud. But sometimes the good deacon had a permission to ask of them. In all these journeyings to and fro, many silent fathers and brethren fell in our way. Usually they paid no more regard to our passage than if we had been a cloud. But sometimes the good deacon had a permission to ask of them, and it was granted by a peculiar movement of the hands, almost like that of a dog's paws in swimming, or refused by the usual negative signs, and in either case with lowered eyelids and a certain air of contrition, as of a man who was steering very close to evil. The monks, by special grace of their abbot, were still taking 2 meals a day, but it was already time for their grand fast, which begins somewhere in September and lasts till Easter, and during which they eat but once in the 24 hours, and that at 2 in the afternoon, 12 hours after they have begun the toil and vigil of the day. Their meals are scanty, but even of these they eat sparingly, and though each is allowed a small carafe of wine, many refrain from this indulgence. Without doubt, the most of mankind grossly overeat themselves. Our meals serve not only for support, but as a hearty and natural diversion from the labour of life. Although excess may be hurtful, I should have thought this Trappist regimen defective, and I am astonished, as I look back, at the freshness of face and cheerfulness of manner of all whom I beheld. A happier nor a healthier company I should scarce suppose that I have ever seen. As a matter of fact, on this bleak upland, and with the incessant occupation of the monks, life is of an uncertain tenure, and death no infrequent visitor at Our Lady of the Snows. This at least was what was told me. But if they die easily, they must live healthily in the meantime, for they seemed all firm of flesh and high in colour, and the only morbid sign that I could observe, an unusual brilliancy of eye, was one that served rather to increase the general impression of vivacity and strength. Those with whom I spoke were singularly sweet-tempered, with what I can only call a holy cheerfulness in air and conversation. There is a note in the direction to visitors telling them not to be offended at the curt speech of those who wait upon them, since it is proper to monks to speak but little. The note might have been spared. To a man, the hospitallers were all brimming with innocent talk, and in my experience of the monastery, it was easier to begin than to break off a conversation. With the exception of Father Michael, who was a man of the world, they showed themselves full of kind and healthy interest in all sorts of subjects, in politics, in voyages, in my sleeping sack, and not without a certain pleasure in the sound of their own voices. As for those who are restricted to silence, I can only wonder how they bear their solemn and cheerless isolation. And yet, apart from any view of mortification, I can see a certain policy, not only in the exclusion of women, but in this vow of silence. I have had some experience of lay phalansteries, of an artistic, not to say a bacchanalian, character, and seen more than one association easily formed, and yet more easily dispersed. With a Cistercian rule, perhaps they might have lasted longer. In the neighbourhood of women, it is but a touch-and-go association that can be formed among defenceless men. The stronger electricity is sure to triumph. The dreams of boyhood, the schemes of youth, are abandoned after an interview of 10 minutes, and the arts and sciences and professional male jollity deserted at once for 2 sweet eyes and a caressing accent. And next, after this, the tongue is the great divider. I'm almost ashamed to pursue this worldly criticism of a religious rule. But there is yet another point in which the Trappist order appeals to me as a model of wisdom. By 2 in the morning, the clapper goes upon the bell, and so on, hour by hour, and sometimes quarter by quarter, till 8, the hour of rest. So infinitesimally is the day divided among different occupations. The man who keeps rabbits, for example, hurries from his hutches to the chapel, to the chapter room, to the refectory all day long. Every hour he has an office to sing, a duty to perform. From 2, when he rises in the dark, till 8, when he returns to receive the comfortable gift of sleep, he is upon his feet and occupied with manifold and changing business. I know many persons worth several thousands in the year who are not so fortunate in the disposal of their lives. Into how many houses would not the note of the monastery bell, dividing the day into manageable portions, bring peace of mind and healthful activity of body? We speak of hardships, but the true hardship is to be a dull fool and permitted to mismanage life in our own dull and foolish manner. From this point of view, we may perhaps better understand the monk's existence. A long novitiate, and every proof of constancy of mind and strength of body is required before admission to the order. But I could not find that many were discouraged. In the photographer's studio, which figures so strangely among the outbuildings, my eye was attracted by the portrait of a young fellow in the uniform of a private of foot. This was one of the novices, who came of age for service, and marched and drilled and mounted guard for the proper time among the garrisons of Algiers. Here was a man who had surely seen both sides of life before deciding, yet as soon as he was set free from service, he returned to finish his novitiate. This austere rule entitles a man to heaven as by right. When the Trappist sickens, he quits not his habit. He lies in the bed of death as he has prayed and laboured in his frugal and silent existence, And when the liberator comes, at the very moment, even before they have carried him in his robe to lie his little last in the chapel among continual chantings, joy bells break forth, as if for a marriage, from the slated belfry, and proclaim throughout the neighbourhood that another soul has gone to God. At night, under the conduct of my kind Irishman, I took my place in the gallery to hear Compline and Salve Regina, with which the Cistercians bring every day to a conclusion. There were none of those circumstances which strike the Protestant as childish or as tawdry in the public offices of Rome. A stern simplicity, heightened by the romance of the surroundings, spoke directly to the heart. I recall the whitewashed chapel, the hooded figures in the choir, the lights alternately occluded and revealed, the strong manly singing, the silence that ensued, the sight of cowled heads bowed in prayer, and then the clear, trenchant beating of the bell, breaking in to show that the last office was over and the hour of sleep had come. And when I remember this, these things have a flavour and a significance that cannot be rendered in words. Only to the faithful can this be made clear, or to one like myself, who is faithful all the world over and finds no form of worship silly or distasteful. Apart from all other considerations, the thought of this perpetual succession of prayers made the time seem pleasant to me in the monastery of Our Lady of the Snows. I have, like other people, my own thoughts about prayer. I find some prayers among the noblest reading in the world. Often, when I am alone, I find a pleasure in making them for myself, as one would make a sonnet. I share, but cannot approve, the superstition that a man may change by his supplications the course of the seasons or the linked events of life. I have prayed in my day, like others, for wicked, foolish, or senseless alterations in the scheme of things. But these gasping complaints are not prayer. It is in prayer that a man resumes his attitude towards God and the world. The thought of his heart comes out of him clean and simple. He takes, in Shakespeare's language, a new acquaintance of himself, and makes of that a new point of departure in belief and conduct. I am tempted to say that a prayer is the highest word of literature. I remember once having heard Salvini in a very great performance, and the words escaped me in my enthusiasm, "I should like to pray." "You have prayed," said a friend who was with me. I think, with all deference, it was a mistake of words, begun by me and continued by my friend. I had not prayed. I had not wished to pray. I had wished to praise, and sure enough, the wish in itself was a sonorous canticle. Prayer issues from another spirit, as warm but considerate and tranquil. As I walked beside my donkey on this voyage, I made a prayer to myself, which I here offer to the reader, as I offer him any other thought that sprung up in me by the way. A voyage is a piece of autobiography at best. Here is my prayer. O God, who givest us day by day the support of thy kindly countenance and hopeful spirit among the manifold temptations and adventures of this life, having brought us this far, do not, O God, desert us, but with continued fervour follow us in our path. Keep us upright and humble, and, O thou who equally guidest all mankind through sun and rain, give us thy spirit of great mercy. Give us peace of mind in our day, O Lord, and a sufficiency of bodily comfort, that we be not tortured by changing friendships or opinions, nor crucified by disease, but ever in strength, constancy, and pleasantness walk in a fair way before thy face and in the sight of men. And if it pleases thee, O Lord, take us soon in health of mind and human of body into thy eternal rest. And God, who has given me the love of women and the friendship of men, keep alive in my heart the sense of old fellowship and tenderness. Make offences to be forgotten and services remembered, and protect those whom I love in all things, and follow them with kindness, so that they may lead simple and unsuffering lives, and in the end die easily with quiet minds. And having said that prayer, I blessed God that I was free to wander, free to hope, and free to love.